Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is March 28th. On this day in 1937, a crime shocked New York City and captivated the nation. The brutal triple murder of 20-year-old model Veronica Gedeon, her mother Mary, and their lodger Frank Byrnes. This wasn't just a murder case, it was a media sensation. It was the kind of story that sent shivers through the city and turned everyday citizens into amateur detectives. This story had everything. It had a beautiful young victim, a shocking crime scene, and a manhunt for a disturbed killer. The case became one of the most sensational true crime stories of the 1930s and made front-page news across the country. Today, we'll delve into this historical case, from Veronica's promising life to the gruesome crime that ended it, the police investigation, and the chilling confession that finally brought the truth to light. Let's get started. Veronica Ronnie Gedeon was born in 1917 and was the kind of young woman who turned heads wherever she went. She was strikingly beautiful and full of ambition. She had dreams of making it big as a model, and by 20 years old, she was well on her way. She had already been featured in a number of popular magazines, including True Detective, where she posed in dramatic, eye-catching crime scene reenactments. In the 1930s, these kinds of magazines were hugely popular. And Veronica's face became familiar to many readers, even if they didn't know her name. Veronica wasn't just a model, though. She was also a fixture in New York City's social scene. She loved going to clubs, attending parties, and meeting artists, actors, and socialites. She had a bold, independent personality, and while she enjoyed the attention that her looks brought her, she also understood the dangers of the world that she was navigating. At the time of her murder, she lived with her mother, Mary Gedeon, in an apartment at 316 East 50th Street in Manhattan. To help make ends meet, Mary rented out a room to a boarder, Frank Byrnes, a middle-aged waiter who had been staying with them for a while. It seemed like an ordinary life in the bustling city, but on March 28, 1937, everything changed. The evening of March 27th started like so many others. Veronica went out with friends and spent the night out enjoying the city's nightlife. She returned home late, quietly slipping into the apartment so as not to wake her mother. But at some point in the early morning hours of March 28th, a nightmare unfolded. An intruder entered their apartment, possibly through an unlocked window. What happened next was a scene of pure terror. Veronica was attacked in her sleep and strangled in her own bed. The signs of struggle in her room suggested that she had fought back, but ultimately, she never stood a chance. Her mother, Mary, was likely awakened by the noise and tried to intervene, but she too was no match for the intruder. She was brutally beaten before also being strangled to death. And then Frank Byrnes, just an innocent boarder caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, was viciously stabbed multiple times with an ice pick. When police arrived, they were horrified by the scene. Veronica's room was in disarray, and the sheer brutality of the attacks on Mary and Frank suggested that there was an uncontrolled rage that had come from this perpetrator. But what made this case really explode in the press was Veronica's modeling career. The newspapers seized on the sensational aspects of the story: her beauty, her provocative photographs, her glamorous lifestyle. It was front page news for weeks, with headlines like "Murder of a Model" and "Who Killed the Blonde Beauty?" The crime became one of the biggest stories of the decade. But behind all of the sensationalism was a real, horrifying mystery. Who could have done this? And why? Detectives wasted no time launching an intense investigation. The pressure was on to catch the killer, and they quickly turned to the people closest to Veronica. Attention turned to Veronica's estranged father, Joseph Gedeon. He had a history of conflict with his family, and investigators wondered if they had had an argument that turned deadly. But Joseph had a solid alibi, and with no actual evidence against him, detectives had to keep looking. And that's when the name Robert Irwin entered the investigation. And honestly, I'm just glad this crime took place 90 years ago, so that's the sweet Australian Robert Irwin isn't associated with this. This Robert Irwin was a sculptor and former lodger at the Gedeon home. He had a history of mental illness, erratic behavior, and violent outbursts. And most disturbingly, he had been obsessed with Veronica's sister, Ethel. Investigators learned that Irwin had been fixated on Ethel for years. He had once lived in that apartment and had left behind disturbing artwork and writings. When police tried to track him down, they discovered he had disappeared. A massive manhunt ensued. Newspapers dubbed him the Mad Sculptor, playing up his artistic background and deranged persona. For months, police chased leads, but Irwin remained elusive. Then, on June 26, 1937, the case took an unexpected turn. Irwin, either out of desperation or desire for attention, walked into the offices of the Chicago Tribune and tried to sell his confession. Yes, you heard that right. He wanted to sell the story of his crimes. Even in the era of yellow journalism, reporters still called the police instead of taking the scoop. When police arrived, Irwin didn't fight. He calmly detailed the murders, explaining that he had gone to the apartment looking for Ethel. When he didn't find her, his rage took over. Veronica then became his target, then her mother, then Frank Byrnes. It was a crime of opportunity and uncontrollable violence. Robert Irwin's trial began in the fall of 1938, and it became one of the most anticipated and widely covered courtroom events of the year. The courtroom was packed daily, drawing crowds of journalists and spectators. Irwin's defense attorneys argued vigorously that their client was not guilty by reason of insanity. They presented extensive evidence of his troubled past, including testimony from psychiatrists who detailed Irwin's history of institutionalization and treatment for mental health issues. In contrast, the prosecution painted Irwin as a dangerous individual whose actions demonstrated clear intent and awareness of what he did wrong. They really honed in on the brutality of the crime scene and the calmness that he displayed during his confession. After days of testimony and intense deliberation, the jury found Robert Irwin guilty. However, due to the substantial evidence of his severe mental illness, he was spared the death penalty. Instead, Irwin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was initially incarcerated at the infamous Sing Sing Correctional Facility, but was later transferred to Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. It was there that he spent the remainder of his life until he died in 1975. The murder of Veronica Gedeon and the media frenzy that followed left a lasting impact on New York City and beyond. For the Gedeon family, the tragedy was unbearable. Veronica's father, Joseph, had already been estranged from the family, but his grief was just compounded by the relentless media coverage. Veronica's sister Ethel was not only devastated at the loss of her sister and mother, but by the horrifying realization that she had been the intended victim. Ethel carried the weight of survivor's guilt for the rest of her life. The trial of Robert Irwin was a spectacle that drew massive public interest. His chilling confession, his unsettling obsession with Ethel, and his bizarre attempt to sell his story to the press all contributed to the public's fascination with him. But beyond the lurid details, the case highlighted deep flaws within the mental health system, particularly the difficulty of managing and monitoring individuals with dangerous tendencies. Some argued after his conviction that the justice system had failed because he was allowed to escape the death penalty, while others believed that his mental illness was undeniable and that life in a psychiatric institution was the most appropriate sentence. In the years following Irwin's incarceration, discussions about crime journalism also began to evolve. The media's portrayal of Veronica, often focusing more on her modeling career and appearances in detective magazines than on her as a person, led to criticism about the way female victims were sensationalized in the press. Headlines often focused on her beauty and lifestyle rather than the brutal loss of her life. This case, among many, many others, contributed to a growing awareness of the ethics of crime reporting and how media shapes narratives about victims, perpetrators, and justice. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!